Paranormal or not, what was the scariest thing to ever happen to you? I was riding down a pitch-black road one night when a stray puppy suddenly bolted toward my bike. I slammed on the brakes to check on her, finding the poor thing shaking with terror. Before I could even process what was happening, two men emerged from the shadows carrying sticks, demanding that I hand the puppy over to them. Adrenaline took over. Without stopping to think, I scooped the pup up, tucked her in front of me on the bike, and sped away as fast as I could. I fostered her for a week until a close friend was able to officially adopt her. I eventually reported the encounter to the police, but the experience was absolutely terrifying. I'm just glad we both made it out safely. In the old neighborhood where I grew up, there was a towering, abandoned windmill that had once been used to pump water. It was a local landmark, but for as long as any of us could remember, it had stood perfectly motionless, its massive wooden blades frozen in time. One afternoon, my friends and I were playing in the overgrown lot surrounding the structure. Without warning, the silence was broken by a heavy groan of timber as the blades suddenly began to rotate, a sight none of us had ever witnessed. The movement was so unexpected and swift that I didn't have time to react. If one of my friends hadn't lunged forward and yanked me out of the way, one of those massive wooden beams would have slammed directly into me. To this day, I still don't know what finally nudged that old machine back to life. I woke in the middle of the night to a level of abdominal pain that was truly horrific. It turned out that an undiagnosed ulcer had perforated my intestines, flooding my abdominal cavity. The agony was paralyzing, easily 10 times worse than the experience of childbirth, and I found myself completely unable to move. My daughter, only 2.5 weeks old, was sleeping in her cot right beside me. It was the most terrifying moment of my life. As I lay there, I was convinced I was going to die right next to her. This might not be as extreme as some other stories, but I once let peer pressure push me into facing my greatest fear, and the results were disastrous. During a family trip to Mexico, everyone began pressuring me to conquer my terror of deep water by jumping into a cenote, one of those incredibly deep, crystal clear natural pools inside a cave. Being 16 and stubborn, I eventually gave in. The moment I hit the water, a wave of pure, unadulterated panic washed over me so intensely that I actually have no memory of the next few minutes. The next thing I knew, I was back on solid ground, sobbing and gasping for air. According to my family, I had scrambled back out of the water with superhuman speed, but the sheer stress of the experience caused me to completely black out. It remains the only time in my life where my primal survival instinct took total control of my body. This happened to a friend of mine while he was out playing soccer with some of the neighborhood kids. During the game, someone accidentally kicked the ball over the wall of an abandoned house that bordered the playground. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that place was completely empty. It had been vacant for years and was perpetually shrouded in darkness. But the second the ball cleared the wall and vanished into the shadows of the property, it was immediately hurled back out toward them. No one was supposed to be in there, but someone, or something, clearly wanted them to keep playing. Thank you, Satan, I guess. This might sound trivial compared to life or death stakes, but in the moment, it felt like my entire world was collapsing. I was at work, spending my day leaving a series of routine voicemails. Like many people working from home, I usually have a YouTube video queued up to watch during the lulls between calls while I'm handling emails. That particular afternoon, I was deep into a true crime documentary about a particularly depraved individual who had kept a girl captive in a shed. The narrator was mid-sentence, graphically describing some truly horrific acts, when I glanced down and realized with a jolt of pure ice that the phone line was still open. The voicemail was still recording. I had potentially just left a 4-minute message filled with stomach-turning true crime descriptions on a complete stranger's professional voicemail. The panic was instantaneous. I actually had to get up from my desk and curl into the fetal position on my living room floor. I was certain I was finished. I spiraled, imagining the recipient calling back in a rage or quality assurance flagging the recording for my manager. I lay there wondering how I'd pay my mortgage or even afford groceries once I was inevitably fired. Once I could breathe again, I decided to test my hardware. Thankfully, my headset has excellent noise-canceling capabilities. I called my own cell phone, let a video run at the same volume, and checked the recording. To my immense relief, there was nothing but a faint, indiscernible murmur in the background. Even though I was technically safe, the adrenaline was so high that I had to take something to calm down that night just to get some sleep. Fortunately, nothing ever came of it, but I'll never forget that I am absolutely ruined moment of total panic. I was on my way home from the club with my boss, both of us laughing hysterically, when a group of 4 men suddenly approached us. They aggressively asked what we were screaming at. We told them we didn't want any trouble and tried to move on, but we quickly realized they were following us. Since there were 4 of them and only 2 of us, we decided to run. My boss was faster and managed to get away, but the group caught up to me and shoved me to the ground. I scrambled back up and started swinging, even managing to land a hit on one of them before another knocked me back down. As soon as I hit the pavement, they began stomping on my head. My memory of the next few moments is almost completely gone. I just remember the heavy thuds on my skull and the sound of my own voice screaming every German curse word I knew. The next thing I remember was being taken into the hospital. The doctors were trying to perform a brain scan, an MRI, I believe, and telling me to lay still, but I couldn't. My face and nostrils were completely covered in blood, and I was struggling just to breathe through it. I eventually woke up in the intensive care unit with my mother and aunt by my side. I stayed in the ICU until the following afternoon before being moved to a regular room for one more night. They stole my watch, but miraculously, I walked away with no lasting brain damage. The police caught the group almost immediately after the attack. One of them still had blood all over his shirt. Because of the severity, the state automatically filed charges for attempted manslaughter. That was over a year and a half ago, and I still haven't heard a word about the lawsuit starting. It's incredibly frustrating because I'm often the one targeted by police for random checks on my way home from work. Yet when a group of people nearly kills someone for no reason, nothing seems to happen. Back then, a friend of mine who knew several local bouncers managed to get a hold of the security footage even before the police did. He offered to help me round up some guys to track them down and retaliate. I thought about it for a long time, and despite a desperate urge to see them bleed, I chose to decline. I realized that seeking revenge would only continue a cycle of meaningless violence. I decided to stick to the legal route and spoke with the police, even though some of my friends looked down on me for it. Even with the frustrating silence from the courts, I'm proud of that decision. I've made plenty of stupid choices in my life, but choosing peace over revenge was easily one of the wisest. When I was about 16, My friend Mason and I were heading over to hang out at our friend Daniel's house after school. For context, Mason and I are black, and Daniel is white. When we arrived, Daniel's family was hosting an event, so he had to stay behind to be social for a bit. Mason and I decided to kill some time at a nearby park I had grown up around. I knew it was open to the public until at least 7 p.m. We were just chilling on the swing sets, talking and waiting until we could head back to Daniel's. We didn't even have our backpacks with us, as we'd left them at his house. Suddenly, a police officer appeared. He claimed there were reports of suspicious individuals spray painting graffiti in the neighborhood. He asked if we had any markers or spray cans, and we told him no. He began grilling us with questions, why we were there, where we went to school, and we answered everything honestly. We even showed him our school IDs and our military dependent cards. Despite our cooperation, we were quickly surrounded by 6 officers standing in a semicircle. They began firing questions at us simultaneously, clearly trying to trip us up or catch us in a contradiction. When they couldn't find a lie, they turned to antagonizing us, making mocking comments like, "Playing on swing sets. My 5-year-old plays on swing sets." I was terrified, but I remember feeling incredibly clear-headed, watching every movement they made. Just as the tension was peaking, Daniel showed up. The moment he walked onto the scene and asked, "What's going on here?" the officers immediately dispersed. It was eerie. There was no apology, and they wouldn't even look him in the eye. They just walked away. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if he had arrived even a few minutes later. This happened a decade ago in Austin, which many consider a liberal hub, but it still sits with me. Mason and I never filed a complaint. At the time, we were just too shaken up to think it was an option or that we'd even be taken seriously. We haven't even talked about it with each other since. I think we both just wanted to move on. When I was a child, I used to stay at my nan's house in the small box room. I frequently woke up there finding myself completely unable to move or speak. Years later, when I mentioned these episodes to my father and my uncle, they both admitted to having the exact same experiences whenever they stayed in that specific room. What makes it so unsettling is that I have never suffered from sleep paralysis anywhere else in my life. I suffered a ruptured ovarian cyst, though the cause of my symptoms wasn't fully determined until a week later. Blood from the rupture had begun to leak toward my intestines, causing severe irritation. This internal bleeding was the reason I had been vomiting uncontrollably throughout that entire week before we finally figured out what was wrong. The first time I truly grasped the reality of mortality was when I was only 7 years old. It hit me through a dream so intense that I woke up at 2 in the morning, screaming and sobbing until my father rushed upstairs to comfort me. Since then, I've also dealt with nightmares featuring hyper-realistic monster faces that flash vividly before my eyes. The experience is incredibly disorienting, almost like being on a drug trip. The image feels like it's zooming in and out or wobbling in a way that is still deeply unsettling to this day. I was just starting down a steep, long hill in the middle of winter when my brake pedals suddenly went all the way to the floor. Fortunately, only one of the 2 braking systems failed, so I was able to pump the brakes enough to bring the car to a stop and eventually limp it to a garage. That sinking feeling of realizing your brakes have failed is something I truly don't recommend. When I was about 10 and my friend was 7, we were walking home from school together. As we headed toward his house, we noticed a man dressed entirely in black who had begun following us. We glanced back and saw him pulling something metallic and shiny out of a black gym bag. Terrified, we both took off at a full sprint, taking a convoluted, zigzagging path to make sure he couldn't figure out exactly which house belonged to my friend. I was driving to work at 3:30 a.m., half awake on a completely empty road, when a deer suddenly slammed into the side of my car. It wasn't a case of me hitting the deer. It felt more like the deer had actually rushed my vehicle. I pulled into a parking lot to make sure the car was still safe to drive, but then I had to navigate the rest of the way home with only one functioning headlight. That part was just as nerve-wracking. Without that light, I had no way of knowing if there were more deer lurking on the side of the road. I was staying in a hotel when I suddenly woke up at 2 a.m. screaming, with the fire alarm in the room blaring. My roommates managed to calm me down, and we hurried out of the room, only to realize the rest of the hotel was deathly silent. The moment we stepped into the hallway, the alarm in our room cut off abruptly. When we reported it to reception, they insisted they had no record of any alarm being triggered. We eventually returned to the room and made it through the rest of the night, though none of us got much sleep. The most unsettling part was what my roommates told me afterward. Apparently, the alarm had been going off for a full 30 seconds before I have any memory of waking up, and during that time, I had been frantically running around the room screaming. I have absolutely no recollection of those moments. I have no idea what caused it, but thinking about that missing gap of time still truly haunts me. I was in the living room watching TV while my oldest brother, who was about 12 at the time, was in the back of the room on the phone. My middle brother, then 10, walked in and started arguing with him, demanding he get off the line because the previous month's bill had reached 400 euros. I was only 8 years old, and as their argument escalated into a physical fight, I scrambled behind the sofa to hide. I stayed as quiet as possible, listening to my oldest brother pacing the room in a blind rage. Terrified and cornered, I waited for a moment when his back was turned to make a break for it. I dashed toward the stairs with him right on my heels. Usually, I would duck into the bathroom when he became aggressive, but he was too close for me to slow down and open the door. I sprinted up the next flight of stairs, screaming for my middle brother to open the door to his room. He threw it open just in time and slammed it shut behind me. Inside the room were my middle brother and 2 of his friends, while my oldest brother continued to rage outside, trying to kick the door down. After a few minutes, my middle brother went out to confront him, but the oldest had broken a heavy metal leg off a storage table and swung it, striking my middle brother's hand and injuring his finger. He retreated back into the room and locked the door again. Knowing he was now armed with a weapon, I grabbed my stuffed animal and crawled under the bed. I found an old army helmet tucked away and put it on, but then I decided to place it on my stuffed animal instead. I felt like we were both in danger, but since I was the only one who cared about his safety, he needed the protection more than I did. My middle brother began calling the police, pleading for help, but the operators kept accusing him of making prank calls and hung up on him twice. Through a hole that had been smashed into the door, I finally crawled out from my hiding spot, grabbed the phone, and screamed into it with everything I had. Eventually, both the police and my parents arrived. I don't remember my brother ever being punished. He usually got away with his behavior. My dad mentioned years later that he once got probation, though I'm not sure if it was for this incident or for hitting a friend. This experience is why I still struggle to trust the police. I was taught as a child that they would be there to help, but when I needed them most, they just hung up. When I was a senior in high school, I was completely head over heels for my boyfriend. We had already been through an incredible amount together. We both struggled with significant mental health challenges, and during the year we'd been dating, we dealt with hospitalizations, a return to self-harm for both of us, my own diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, and the stress of me coming out to my parents. One morning during second period, we were texting back and forth while my class was quiet. He was feeling suicidal, which was a frequent struggle for him, and I was trying my best to help from afar, though there wasn't much I could do. The last message he sent was a simple, ominous, "I'm sorry." Shortly after, my teacher resumed the lesson, and I had to put my phone away. As the day progressed, I kept reaching out, but he didn't respond. Initially, I tried to rationalize it, thinking he might have had a forgotten doctor's appointment. But as the hours dragged on, a heavy sense of dread took hold. I debated rushing out of class to drive to his house, but I was terrified of what I might find or how much worse I could make the situation if I panicked. At the end of the school day, I went to his sixth period teacher to see if he had shown up. When she said no, every atom in my body suddenly felt heavier. My knees went weak and my head began to spin. I was convinced I was too late, that he was gone, and that it was entirely my fault. I broke down in tears, and the teacher pulled me into the hallway, asking if we had been in a fight. I just shook my head and whispered through the sobs, "I think he's dead." Her jaw dropped. I recounted the entire day, the final text, the silence, and his fragile state of mind. She suggested his phone might just be dead, but he did most of his classes online from home. He wasn't the type to let his phone die. I was taken to the counselor's office, even as I begged them to let me go to his house since I had a key. I felt like every second mattered if there was any chance of saving him. While the school called his mother, they suggested I try calling him one more time. I was certain he wouldn't pick up. The first call went to voicemail. I tried again immediately. After several rings, a weak, soft voice finally answered. I let out a sob of pure relief. It turned out he had attempted to overdose on a mix of over-the-counter medications and had been unconscious for about 5 hours. It was pure luck that he woke up and answered the phone when he did. He nearly gave me a heart attack, and he still has no memory of that day or the immediate aftermath. Given the amount of medication he took, it's a miracle he didn't suffer more severe physical side effects. Today, he told me it's the first time he hasn't felt suicidal since he was 10 years old. He has put in an immense amount of work to get to this point, and I couldn't be more proud of the person he's become. It was about 4 a.m., and I was heading into work with my gas tank on empty. I pulled up to a pump at a station where a few other people were fueling up. The music blaring from the overhead speakers was so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. As I pulled in, I noticed a man leaning against a wall near a van, but I didn't think much of it. Just as I slid the nozzle into my car, I realized he was trying to get my attention. I couldn't make out what he was saying over the music, so I stepped a little closer. He asked if I had jumper cables. I didn't, so I told him no. Then he asked if I could call his girlfriend to come pick him up and take him to work. He gave me a number, but the voicemail was full. He gave me a second number, and it was the same story. At that point, I started to feel uneasy, imagining a long string of messages from people just like me trying to deliver the same script. Then the request changed. He asked if I could drive him to his car. This caught me off guard because I had assumed the van he was leaning against was his. He explained that his car was actually about half a mile up the road at another gas station. I knew the place he was talking about. It wasn't a 24-hour station, and it was located in a dark, secluded, and somewhat sketchy area. He claimed someone had lent him a bike to get down to this station and asked for a ride back to his car. It was the middle of winter, and the story felt increasingly thin. I wondered who would be out riding a bike in freezing temperatures in the middle of the night, let alone lending it to a total stranger. I reluctantly agreed, wanting to be a good person and stay objective, but the moment the words left my mouth, I regretted it. The inconsistencies were piling up too fast. He told me he just needed to drop the bike inside the station for the owner to retrieve, and then we could go. The second he stepped through the door, I hung up the nozzle, thankfully before I'd even started the pump, jumped into my seat, and hightailed it out of there. This story requires a little bit of backstory, so bear with me. As a kid, I used to walk over to the auto shop behind my house to buy sodas from their vending machine. To get there, I had to trek through several gravel lots and pass a particularly creepy, dilapidated shed that came with our property. The shed was literally falling apart, and while my parents had talked about tearing it down for years, they just hadn't gotten around to it. One night, my mom sent me out after dark to grab some drinks. I started the walk, but when I was about halfway to the machine, I heard a distinct thump coming from inside the shed. I froze and looked back, but when I didn't see anything, I shrugged it off as nothing. I grabbed the sodas and started heading home. This time, when I reached the halfway point, I heard another thump from the shed, much louder than the first. Thoroughly spooked, I stopped dead in my tracks and stared at the structure. Suddenly, a pale, humanoid shape poked its head out of the ruins and began crawling into the open. It was incredibly skinny, flesh-colored, and I could clearly see its ribs. I started to panic, my mind racing. What on earth is that thing? Once it finally freed all four of its limbs from the wreckage, it took off, sprinting away on all fours. Only then did the adrenaline fade enough for me to realize it was just a dog. Even so, it absolutely terrified me, and I never went near that shed in the dark ever again. I was going through my day like usual when my stepdad came home drunk. When he drinks, he becomes aggressive very quickly. I was hungry and asked if there was anything to eat, and he told me to make a sandwich using the tuna in the bowl and a cucumber. I asked if I could just eat the cucumber on the side because I love them, and he immediately flew into a rage and started yelling. My mom sent me to my room to get me away from him. Terrified, I grabbed a stick with nails in it to protect myself. About a minute later, he slammed my door open, saw the stick, and lunged at me. I started hitting him with it, hoping he'd get off, but he began choking me. I kept swinging until my arms simply stopped moving. I couldn't move or breathe, and as everything started to go dark, I began to hear a chorus of whispers. Finally, my mom grabbed the stick from my hand and struck him in the head. He let go, stood up, and stormed out of the house to his car. My mom called the police, and we drove to a nearby parking lot to meet them. When they arrived, they asked if I was okay. I told them I felt funny, and they simply wrote it down, shook hands, and left without taking any further action. While there have been many incidents like this, that one was the most terrifying. To this day, I still have nightmares about him attacking me. Whenever he raises his voice, I am instantly transported back to those moments. I feel a massive adrenaline rush, a sharp pain in my sternum, and I struggle to breathe as dizziness sets in. My dog often goes crazy, barking at random spots in my room, and then she'll flatly refuse to go near whatever she was just growling at. One morning, I was sitting on my bed waiting to head to school when she started acting up again, facing my open bedroom door. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was busy looking out the window to check the weather, trying to see if it would be clear enough to play football later that day. My parents had already left for work, and my sisters were downstairs waiting for it to be time to leave. As I stared outside, I noticed the air was perfectly still and the sun was out. Suddenly, my bedroom door slammed shut with incredible force. I spun around, startled by the noise, and stared at the door for a second before looking back out the window. There wasn't even a hint of a breeze. It was completely eerie. When I was around 7 or 8 years old, I spent almost every day riding my bike through my neighborhood. I had several houses where I would stop regularly to hang out. Looking back, I realize how incredibly patient those adults were to put up with me every day. One afternoon, I noticed a beat-up purple van pull onto our street near the entrance. I didn't recognize it as belonging to anyone in the neighborhood, but I didn't think much of it at first until I realized they weren't passing me. They were staying right behind me, following my every turn. My street ended in a main cul-de-sac with a second one branching off of it. I quickly cut through the main one and turned down the second, stopping immediately when I saw a group of people outside. As I circled around to watch, I saw the van make a quick U-turn in the main cul-de-sac, mimicking my path. They waved at me as they sped back up the street toward the entrance. I am absolutely certain that if those people hadn't been standing outside when I stopped, I would have been kidnapped that day. When I was about 5 years old, my mom made soup for me and my siblings, and I went into the kitchen to grab a spoon. Just as I picked one up and turned around, a bowl suddenly fell from the shelf and shattered on the floor right in front of me, spraying glass everywhere. My mom rushed into the room and found me standing there shaking, still clutching the spoon and staring at the mess. At first, she thought I had done something reckless, but luckily I wasn't hurt. The strangest part happened afterward when my mom tried to figure out where the bowl had come from. She checked the shelves and realized that everything was exactly where it belonged. Not a single item was missing or out of place. To this day, we have no idea what actually fell and broke, but it scared me to death. When I was 16, I was laying in bed one evening when I suddenly felt what I can only describe as a mild electrical current pulsing through my body. A split second later, a voice that wasn't my own, and one I couldn't categorize as male or female, began repeating in my head, "Turn on the light, turn on the light, turn on the light." I lay there confused for several seconds until the current intensified and my bed began to gently shake. Since it was a single ensemble on wheels resting on a slate floor, the movement was distinct. By this point, I was paralyzed with fear. The bed began shaking violently, banging against the wall as the voice became increasingly urgent. Finally, I swung my legs over the side and put my feet on the ground. Immediately, the shaking and the voice stopped. The room was still dark. I glanced to my left at my wardrobe mirror and saw a figure standing with their right hand on their hip. In the reflection, they appeared to be standing directly in front of me, yet there was absolutely no one there in the physical room. I leaped up and finally switched on the light. The entire ordeal lasted maybe 30 seconds, and I slept with the light on for the rest of the night. My room was a converted outside shed, and following that experience, I started locking my door religiously. Not many nights later, a man, I could tell his stature through the glass. Tried to force his way into my room, but he was unable to get in because of the lock. At the time, I didn't make the connection, but I'm now convinced that the voice and the shaking were someone or something trying to protect me. I'm still not entirely sure who that figure in the mirror was, though. I know this might seem a bit surreal, but I was only 11 at the time. Every summer, my granny would take us to a caravan park by the sea with all our second cousins. One night, while the adults were chatting and the kids were playing in the living area, we heard the door handle turn. My aunt walked in, talking to someone who was still standing outside. Moments later, a man who was clearly intoxicated or under the influence followed her in, babbling incoherently. I don't remember everything he said, but he seemed to be oscillating between apologizing and telling us what a beautiful family we were. The mood shifted instantly when my aunt tried to edge him back toward the door. He suddenly snapped, screaming profanities, curses, and direct threats at us. My cousins and I, all around the same age, sat there frozen as this man shrieked death threats at the top of his lungs. It was nearly midnight, and he was loud enough to wake half the park. After a few minutes of this, a miracle appeared in the form of a neighbor from the caravan next door who stepped in and told the guy to shove off. As the drunk man finally stumbled outside, he started shouting, and I'm being completely serious, beans on toast, over and over again. My cousins and I were just gaping at the scene when the man suddenly swung a punch at the neighbor's face. It devolved into a full-on brawl, and park security had to be called to break it up. The neighbor ended up with severe bruising and a fractured jaw just for stepping in to help us. So yeah, quite the summer memory. This story is a bit different from what I've shared before, but here it is. My daughter was born with severe health defects, and from the very beginning, we knew our time with her would be short. It was a devastating reality to accept, but eventually, we found what peace we could. Life fell into a grueling rhythm. For 2 years, she spent nearly half her time in the hospital, and while at home, she required 24-hour care. Her mother was rarely ever away from her side, while I took on the responsibility of working to keep a roof over our heads. When our little one was hospitalized, as long as she remained stable, I usually had to stay behind to work, driving in on weekends or whatever days I could afford to miss without losing the rent money. It was 2 years of pure terror every time my wife called me at work. 2 years of obsessively checking my phone battery to ensure it hadn't died, and 2 years of absolute panic if I ever dropped it. In February of this year, I finally received the phone call I had spent those years dreading. Our daughter was in the hospital again. Things had been declining, but she had been stable enough that we mutually decided I should head home to work. We always made that choice together. If my wife ever needed me there, the job be damned, I would be there. When the phone rang, my wife was sobbing and incoherent. She eventually handed the phone to a nurse, who explained that our daughter was crashing and they believed this was the end. She didn't really need to explain. I knew the moment I answered. By the time the nurse was on the line, I was already in my car and on the road. The 2-hour drive to the hospital was the longest of my life. I've worked in dangerous fields and have faced death myself more than once, but I have never been more terrified than I was in those hours, fearing my child was slipping away and my wife was facing it alone. I was able to make it in time. I got to kiss her little face and tell her I would love her forever. She held on for one more day, and when she finally passed, she was in both of our arms. We wept then, and we still do. For reference, I'm a 4 feet 5 inches disabled woman, and people who don't know me often get confused about my age. That detail is important for what happened. Last November, my mom and I were on a long road trip to be with my granny, who was in hospice. We stopped for gas in a tiny, one-stoplight town. My mom ran inside to pay while I stayed by the car to stretch my legs. I noticed a massive black SUV drive by a couple of times. It was hard to miss, being both gigantic and one of the only 2 vehicles moving in the entire area. After circling twice, it pulled into a spot directly across from ours. Nobody got out. The windows were heavily tinted, so I couldn't see inside, but I had the distinct, skin-crawling feeling that someone was watching me. If I'd been thinking clearly, I would have checked the plates or gotten back in the car, but I was distracted and didn't react. The moment my mom stepped out of the station, the driver floored it. He peeled out of the lot like he'd just robbed the place, leaving rubber on the pavement. It took me about an hour to fully process what had just happened, but now I frequently think about what might have occurred if she hadn't come out exactly when she did. I didn't have my phone on me, and my purse was still in the car. I would have had no way to call for help. During my time in college, I began experiencing a series of sudden neurological issues, including tremors, shaking, and cognitive difficulties. I had recently been hospitalized for bilateral pneumonia and what we suspected was mononucleosis, so I initially assumed these symptoms were just lingering side effects of being so ill. However, the situation quickly escalated. I began shaking almost constantly, forgetting common words, and struggling to speak. It all culminated in what I now believe were absence seizures. I vividly remember sitting on my bedroom floor, completely unable to move, simply watching my hands tremble uncontrollably. That was the moment I realized something was fundamentally wrong. I eventually saw a doctor and discovered I had untreated late-stage Lyme disease. The infection had actually progressed to my brain. After a rigorous course of antibiotics, the infection was cleared, though I still live with some lasting brain damage. Looking back, the most terrifying part wasn't just the symptoms, but the sheer unknown, knowing that my brain was failing me in the middle of a heavy, 10-class semester and having no idea why. 14 months into our marriage, my husband was diagnosed with aplastic anemia, and he became incredibly ill. He was covered in tubes, and the situation was so precarious that I had to wear full PPE just to be in the same room as him. Even the doctors were at a loss on how to treat him, which made the experience even more harrowing. That remains the most terrifying time of my life, the overwhelming fear that I was about to lose my soulmate so soon after our life together had begun. I was in a Mexican resort town with 4 friends for a bachelor party. We had spent a great evening enjoying dinner and drinks, feeling perfectly safe among the friendly locals and international tourists. The trouble started when we approached a lively bar. 3 of us went inside, while 2 stayed out to smoke. When they didn't follow us, we stepped back out to find the police harassing them. Before we could even ask what was happening, the officers shoved our friends into the back of a truck and sped off. The bouncer told us the police were likely heading to a station 10 minutes north, but would probably spend 30 minutes rounding up more people. He explained that these local officers often arrest people specifically to extort bribes. We arrived at the station just as our friends were being brought in handcuffs. When we asked why they were being held, an officer claimed they were drunk, a blatant lie, as those 2 were the designated drivers and hadn't had a drop to drink. When the officer realized we were Mexican American and spoke Spanish, he consulted with his colleagues. Suddenly, they lunged at us, restrained us, and forced us behind bars. They claimed we were also drunk and insisted we needed a doctor's clearance to leave, then conveniently mentioned the doctor wouldn't be back for a week. Terrified, I used my one phone call to contact my godfather, a federal officer. I explained the situation in English to keep the guards from understanding, but they began yelling at me, snatched the phone, and shoved us into overcrowded, sweltering cells. The conditions were horrific. There were about 18 men packed into a tiny, dimly lit space with nothing but a hole in the floor for a toilet. The air was thick and the tension was high. At one point, a man in the cell began singing drunkenly. The guards dragged him out and beat him so severely, he began making agonizing, labored breathing noises. Later that night, a group of well-dressed men arrived to inspect the cells. I was told later they were narcos looking for their own people or rivals. Around noon the next day, they finally pulled the 5 of us out. They made us empty our wallets, taking the $400 we had between us, and told us we were lucky to have nice friends before letting us go. It turned out my godfather had spent the entire night calling stations across Baja California until he tracked us down. He had to send another federal officer to the station personally to force our release. The aftermath was even scarier than the night itself. My godfather told us that as Mexican Americans, we were targeted because we lacked the armor often afforded to white tourists. The police had actually been debating whether to extort our families for fines or simply sell us to a cartel for ransom, a path that usually ends in being dissolved in acid or dismembered. It breaks my heart because I love my culture and I love Mexico, but the lawlessness is staggering. My own family has been devastated by cartel violence. My grandparents even lost their home because a cartel simply decided it belonged to them. I've made a vow not to return until the violence is addressed, because it is truly terrifying to realize that in a place without the rule of law, there is no one to call when you are in danger. I was driving in my first lake effect blizzard, and since I lived in West Michigan, I quickly learned just how intense those storms can get. I had a 50-minute commute to work in total whiteout conditions, and along the way, I passed at least 5 jackknifed semis and numerous cars that had slid off into the ditch. Even though I was maintaining the highway speed limit, I still had other drivers zooming past me as if the visibility weren't practically zero. When I was a toddler, between the ages of 2 and 3, my parents lived on a military base. Before we moved there, my great-aunt had given me an ornate clock decorated with little gnomes. Because the ticking was so loud it could be heard over the baby monitor, my father had eventually removed the AA batteries to keep the house quiet at night, a detail that became chillingly important later. The activity began in the living room. On several occasions, my father would catch a glimpse of a black, 4-legged creature rushing past the hallway door out of the corner of his eye. At first, he brushed it off as a trick of the light. The situation became undeniable, however, one night when both my parents were together. My father saw the dog-like figure pass the doorway again, and before he could say a word, my mother turned to him and admitted, "I've seen it too." The most harrowing part of the experience involved me. My parents were frequently jolted awake by my screaming in the middle of the night, not the typical cries of a toddler, but the sounds of absolute, visceral terror. They would rush into my room to find me sitting upright, staring at the foot of my bed and screaming. My father was always most unsettled by the fact that the battery-less clock would start ticking loudly through the baby monitor moments before the screaming began. On one particular night, my father claimed he saw the black, dog-like shadow bolt out of my bedroom just as he arrived to comfort me. I'm not sure if my mind is playing tricks on me because I was so young, or if the experience was simply too traumatic to forget, but I still have a vivid memory of a black, humanoid figure standing at the end of my bed, staring at me menacingly. Even now, in my late 20s, that lingering fear persists. I still can't stand the sound of an analog clock ticking, and I still get nervous looking toward the foot of my bed at night, half expecting to see that figure waiting there again. Looking back, one of the most intense experiences I've had was the night my ex, her sister, and I went ghost hunting at a cemetery in rural Oklahoma. A police officer on a major power trip showed up and ended up pointing his gun directly in my face. To make matters worse, he refused to let me drive my own car, claiming that because I wasn't American or Canadian, I wasn't allowed behind the wheel, despite the fact that I had both my passport and my driver's license on me. He even made a sweeping, nonsensical comment that none of those Mexican, Swiss, or Europeans were permitted to drive there. In another unsettling turn of events involving that same ex, she experienced a miscarriage. While she had initially sworn she was consistently taking her birth control, she eventually admitted she had stopped because she wanted a baby, even though we were nowhere near ready for that step. It really goes to show that when you're looking through rose-colored glasses, all those red flags just look like flags. However, the scariest thing I've ever experienced in the moment has to be the episodes of sleep paralysis I've dealt with. The worst instance involved a massive, headless, muscular figure standing right next to my bed. He was leaning over me while I lay there, unable to move or breathe for what felt like an eternity. My best friend and his family used to experience recurring, identical nightmares of drowning in a sea of darkness whenever they slept in their basement. This happened to every member of the family at some point, and despite calling in priests multiple times to bless and purify the house, the dreams never stopped. To be honest, I'm not someone who believes in ghosts or the paranormal, but even I got chills hearing both of his parents recount their experiences with those nightmares in such vivid, haunting detail. I am being dead serious, and this experience haunts me to this day. I used to spend a lot of time exploring the woods behind my subdivision, where I'd frequently find random items like needles, alcohol bottles, old boots, and clothes. I never thought much of it until one afternoon. I found what I am certain was a human cranium. At first glance, I thought it was just a uniquely shaped rock, but when I picked it up, the weight and texture made it clear it wasn't a rock at all. Since that day, my life hasn't been the same. Whether it was a genuine haunting or a traumatic event that triggered a deep psychological break, things changed instantly. I've struggled significantly with seeing things that aren't there. I was recently prescribed ziprasidone, a heavy antipsychotic, but even while taking it, the visions persisted. Because the medication didn't stop what I was seeing, I became convinced that I had angered a spirit by disturbing those remains. I even brought back evidence from the site that day, though I've never told a soul about it. Later, when I tried to take a friend back to the spot to investigate, we couldn't find a trace of it. I dated a girl for 3 years in college, and before meeting her, I had never experienced anything remotely paranormal. It started small, pennies appearing in our locked dorm room, items being slightly out of place, or lights and appliances mysteriously switching off. At the time, we just laughed it off. However, once we moved into an apartment and got a dog, things took a noticeably darker turn. The sensation of being watched became overwhelming. Our dog would constantly scan the room, his eyes tracking something invisible to us. He would frequently stand in the kitchen with both of us and growl aggressively down the empty hallway. Eventually, bowls started flying off the countertops, and the situation felt like it was spiraling out of control. The most terrifying moment happened around 4 a.m. one night. We were sleeping in a lofted bed about 4 feet off the ground. She was on the inside against the wall, and I was on the outside. Suddenly, the dog let out a single bark, and I felt a pair of hands grip my ankles and yank me toward the edge. In a desperate attempt to stay on the bed, I flipped onto my stomach and grabbed my partner's waist, waking her in a panic. I couldn't hold on, but I managed to break my fall enough to land upright on the floor. When we turned on the lights, the dog was still in his kennel, but I had clear red marks around both of my ankles. I've never been a restless sleeper. In fact, that's why I was always given the top bunk as a kid. Neither of us could explain what had happened. We eventually broke up for unrelated reasons, but looking back years later, it's clear that whatever energy followed her was not friendly. I'm just glad nothing more serious happened, though thinking about it now still makes me incredibly uneasy. One bright, sunny afternoon, I was driving along a rural stretch of highway between 2 small towns in North Carolina. As I approached an overpass, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A Native American man walked out of the woods and stepped toward the road. In a total panic, I slammed on my brakes and whipped my head around to look directly at him, but he vanished instantly. I had clearly seen him take 3 or 4 distinct steps before he disappeared. I still remember the exact spot where it happened, and I find myself looking for him every time I drive past. The strangest part, however, came a couple of days later. I was grabbing coffee at a local shop when I saw an announcement for a spiritual retreat and event center in that same town. They were hosting a Native American flute player that very weekend. Up until that moment, I hadn't known the center or the musician even existed. When I drove by the venue later and got back on the highway, I realized the event center was only about a mile or 2 from where I'd seen the apparition. He had been walking directly in that direction. When I was 10 years old, I remember being incredibly sick, the kind of illness that makes it nearly impossible to even get out of bed. One night, I woke up to the sound of my father moving around the house. I managed to get up, but my perception of time was completely distorted. I felt like I was moving in extreme slow motion, while he seemed to be moving at double speed, like a video played on fast forward. I tried to follow him, but he was zooming from room to room while I struggled to keep up. He didn't seem to notice me at all, almost as if I weren't actually there. Eventually, I managed to catch up to him in the kitchen, and the moment I did, everything snapped back to normal. When I told him about what happened, he suggested I might have been astral projecting. I've had other strange experiences like that before, but that one remains one of the most vivid. While traveling alone on the West Coast, I booked a night at an Airbnb campsite. I arrived within my selected window, but the host was immediately disgruntled because I hadn't seen or replied to a message he sent asking for my exact arrival time. I apologized, and as we kept talking, he mentioned that he didn't actually provide tents, something that hadn't been mentioned in the listing. He told me he could rent me one, but only if I handed over my debit card. I felt uneasy, but since I'd already paid the reservation fee and desperately needed a tent, I gave it to him. He disappeared upstairs with my card for at least 5 minutes. When he finally returned, he handed back the card along with the tent, a sleeping mat, and a poorly labeled hand-drawn map. Anxious to get away from him, I grabbed the gear and started driving toward what I assumed was the site. I spent over an hour wandering the woods. By the time the sun began to set, I found myself on an incredibly narrow road deep in the forest. Something felt wrong, so I decided to screw it, cut my losses, and find a hotel instead. As I was driving out of the woods in the dark, I passed a car zooming down the road in the direction I had just been heading. It was the host. He later claimed to Airbnb that he was coming out to check on me, but he also filed a formal complaint demanding money to replace the tent and mad I hadn't returned. I had to write a long explanation to Airbnb, detailing that as a 26-year-old woman traveling alone, this man had made me feel so unsafe that I didn't feel I could return to his house for directions. I pointed out that when a young woman goes missing in the woods, a normal person gets worried. They don't immediately demand property reimbursements. I try not to dwell on what might have happened if I hadn't turned that car around when I did. Being alone, deep in the woods, with a stranger who had my debit card information was a recipe for disaster. I feel lucky to be here, and I've officially retired from solo camping. I've been a youth STEM instructor for several years, essentially a glorified camp counselor, and I'm currently studying to become a teacher. Over the last 4 years, I've worked with countless children, but this week, I saw a face on the news that stopped me cold. It was a man I recognized as a nanny for some of the kids who had been in my classes. He had been arrested and charged with sexually assaulting children, the very children I had been responsible for. I don't think I've ever felt such a paralyzing mix of horror, disgust, and shame all at once. The realization that I was caring for these children while they were being abused, and that I never noticed a thing, is absolutely terrifying. It has shaken my confidence so deeply that I'm actually reconsidering my entire career path out of a fear that something like this could happen again without me knowing. I survived what I can only describe as an attempted murder when a car intentionally struck our motorcycle. I fell from the bike and was thrown quite a distance, rolling across the pavement. Strangely, when I think back on the actual accident, I don't feel a sense of panic. The fear manifests differently now. Since that day, I've become terrified of traffic and sharp turns whenever I'm on a two-wheeler. It's an odd psychological shift because the hit and run didn't even happen at a turn and there was no other traffic on the road at the time. Despite that, the anxiety hits me whenever I'm out riding, and I can't seem to shake it. I was around 7 years old when it happened. I am an adult now, and to this day, the memory alone is enough to frighten me. My family has always been somewhat sensitive to the supernatural. We were at a family friend's house for a party. I believe it was New Year's Eve, and the atmosphere was already dark and a bit spooky. There weren't many other children around except for my 2 older cousins, who mostly avoided me, so I was left to my own devices. Eventually, I got bored, and the hostess suggested I go down to the playroom in the basement. Being a typically independent kid, I headed for the door. The stairs were covered in tan carpet with a sleek railing. As I took my first few steps down into the light, I heard a distinct shuffling noise coming from below. Assuming it was my cousins, I called out their names. The noise stopped abruptly. I reached the halfway point of the staircase when something suddenly peered out from behind the wall at the bottom. It couldn't have been more than 4 feet tall. It was oddly round and a black, so deep it looked like an abyss, the darkest thing I have ever seen. The only features were 2 tiny, white, pupilless eyes. The sight was so sudden I nearly lost my footing. I froze, staring at it, and a wave of pure malice washed over me. I just knew, with the certainty of a child, that it wanted to hurt me. The creature leaned out further from behind the pillar, revealing a wide, sinister smile, or perhaps it was baring its teeth. At that point, I screamed and bolted back up the stairs, tripping over my own feet in a panic. I felt a terrifying sensation that I was going to die, and worse, I could feel that whatever it was found my struggle hilarious. I slammed the basement door and ran straight to my mother. My father went down to check, but of course, he found nothing. It was conveniently gone. To this day, the only person who truly believes me is my grandmother. Even my mother, despite having her own paranormal experiences, thinks I was just tired. I will never forget that creature. I don't know what it was or where it came from, but I hope I never have to see it again. There is a stretch of woodland near where my late wife and I used to live. About 10 years ago, on an early Sunday morning, we decided to take a walk through those woods. We eventually stumbled upon a clearing where we saw roughly 20 black men dressed in hooded robes, standing in a wide circle and facing one another in absolute silence. To say we were unsettled would be an understatement. We watched them for a few minutes, completely still, until one of them spotted us. At that moment, the entire group turned in unison to look at us. They didn't move or speak, they just stared. The silence was so heavy you could have heard a pin drop. We noped out of there as fast as we could, convinced we had just stumbled upon some kind of supernatural or cult-like event. However, I later discovered a perfectly reasonable explanation. A local church was running an inspirational program for young men. They frequently went into the forest on Sunday mornings to pray and meditate in silence. While I have to admit it felt incredibly creepy and spooky at the moment, there was nothing supernatural about it at all. In a strange way, I almost felt a bit let down that the truth was so ordinary. I was at work when I suddenly started having terrifying vision issues. It felt as though I was looking through a layer of crumpled cellophane in the top left corner of my field of vision. It was so disorienting that I panicked. At 30-odd years old, I immediately called my mom, convinced I was having a stroke or something equally dire. My anxiety was through the roof, but she managed to calm me down. Since I wasn't experiencing any other symptoms, she suggested waiting an hour to see if it cleared before calling a doctor. Sure enough, the visual distortion vanished within the hour, only to be replaced by the most agonizing migraine I have ever experienced. Having suffered from migraines since grade school, I knew this was on a completely different level. That was my first introduction to ocular migraines. Fun times. I personally don't find this story scary, and I still don't, but everyone I tell seems to think it's terrifying, so here it is. When I was between 1 and 3 years old, I lived in a condo with 7 other people. At night, I was able to climb out of my crib without anyone noticing, and I'd spend hours playing quietly with my toys in the living room. Eventually, I created an imaginary friend to keep me company. He was a kind man I named Jerry. He would play dolls with me, and we'd talk about all sorts of random things. The only catch was that he only ever came out to play at night. As it turns out, Jerry wasn't an imaginary friend at all. He was actually a homeless man who had been living in our attic the entire time. We were playing hide and seek, and knowing my cousins were terrified of the dark, I decided the basement was the perfect hiding spot. I hadn't been down there long when I heard everyone in the house start calling my name. I could even hear my mother's voice, sounding frantic and tearful as she shouted for me. At the time, I just assumed it was a clever tactic my cousins had cooked up to trick me into giving away my position. Then, one of my aunts burst into the basement with a flashlight. She began rummaging through the storage and scanning every corner while screaming my name. I was sitting right there, literally right in front of her, but she didn't seem to see me at all. The look of pure, raw terror on her face eventually broke me, and I started to cry. As soon as she ran back upstairs, I followed close behind her and announced that I was right there. To my shock, everyone erupted into tears, claiming they had been searching for me for nearly an hour. To me, it had felt like barely 5 minutes had passed. I was only 5 years old at the time, and while I've wondered if my family was just pulling a massive prank, the memory of their genuine panic still scares me to this day. While this may not compare to some of the near-death experiences others have shared, it's a memory that has stuck with me since I was 10 years old. It was late at night during a heavy storm. My parents were out, and my sisters were away at a school event, leaving me home alone playing Xbox. Suddenly, the power cut out. To understand how terrified I was, you have to know that as a child, I was absolutely petrified of the dark. The constant fear that someone was lurking just around the corner haunted me. The moment the lights vanished, I started trembling. In a panic, I grabbed my dog by the collar and bolted out of the house, racing toward my neighbor's place. They were kind people who definitely would have taken me in, but after I spent 5 minutes knocking frantically in the pouring rain and darkness, it became clear no one was home. Genuinely terrified at that point, I ran down the street to a friend's house, dragging my dog along with me. Looking back, she would have been perfectly fine at home, but I think I needed her there for my own peace of mind. My friend's family took me in and helped me calm down, but then I realized in my haste I had left my front door wide open. My friend's dad was great about it. He went over and locked up for me since he knew where we kept the spare keys. I called my parents to explain everything, and they assured me they'd be home in 5 minutes. The relief was overwhelming. Even now, I still have a lingering hatred of the dark, and yes, I'm still the person who sprints up the stairs the second I hit the light switch. My wife told me a story from back when she was a teenager, around the early 2000s, the era before everyone had a cell phone glued to their hand. She was at a friend's house with her sister, their best friend, the friend's baby sister they were babysitting, and the family dog. Naturally, they decided to watch a horror movie involving a creepy baby. As the movie played, they noticed a doll lying on the floor, and every time the baby crawled, the doll seemed to autonomously follow right behind her. Being 3 teenage girls home alone with a possessed doll, they completely lost their minds for about 3 minutes. They were frantically sprinting around the house trying to find a landline to call 911, with the baby and the stocking doll trailing behind them, which only added to the chaos. Finally, in a desperate bid for survival, they convinced the dog to attack the doll. Upon closer inspection, they realized the terrifying supernatural entity was actually just attached to the baby's outfit by a long, loose piece of thread. My wife says it's the absolute dumbest she's ever felt in her life. the mother of my children, folks. This might be minor compared to some stories, but about 4 years ago, I was driving home from southern Maryland when I got caught in a derecho. It absolutely terrified me because there was zero warning. 1 minute it was fine, and the next, it felt like a scene straight out of a disaster movie. The wind was so violent that I vividly remember telling my girlfriend, "Yell the second you see a tornado touch down." With the power out, the stoplights were dead, making every intersection a chaotic, high-stakes guessing game. I was paralyzed by indecision, having no idea what the safest move was. Should I pull over and stay with the car, keep driving to get out of the path, or abandon the vehicle and run for cover? It was one of those rare, visceral moments where I truly feared for my safety. About a year or two ago, I was hiking through the woods in Lake Tahoe with my dad and a few other relatives. The outing was peaceful until, without any warning, we came face to face with a pack of wolves. We stood there for a few seconds, locked in mutual eye contact, before they suddenly turned and took off into the trees. Even though the encounter was brief, those few seconds filled me with a sense of genuine, visceral fear. I've since done some research and realized that I probably wasn't in any actual danger, but in that moment, it was easily one of the most intimidating experiences of my life. When I was a child, I had an overwhelming fear of the dark. The apartment we lived in at the time didn't actually have interior doors, so at night, my room was just a small island of dim light surrounded by a vast, pitch-black void that stretched into the living room and kitchen. On those restless, sleepless nights, I would scan the room and catch movement out of the corner of my eye. I'd see a group of short, gremlin-like creatures watching me, all of them wearing unnervingly wide grins. The second I tried to look at them directly, they would dart away and hide behind the nearest object, a wall, a box, or whatever was closest. Looking back on it now, it's a bit unsettling to wonder how I ever managed to get over that. When I was about 4 years old, my dad accidentally backed over me with his pickup truck. I had been kneeling directly behind the vehicle, preoccupied with something on the ground, and he simply couldn't see me from the driver's seat. Because of how I was positioned, the bumper caught the back of my head and pushed me flat onto my stomach. The truck rolled right over me. I vividly remember lying there, watching the massive tires rotate just inches from my face. I let out a blood-curdling scream that, luckily, my dad heard. He slammed on the brakes, and I scrambled out from under the chassis with nothing more than a headache, and probably a fair bit of lingering trauma. As narrow an escape as that was, it still doesn't quite top the story of my great-aunt Rosie. When she was a little girl, she actually fell straight through the hole of the family outhouse. I was around 7 years old when I spent the night at my Lola's house. I decided to sleep in the living room because the guest room always made me uneasy, mostly due to a collection of dolls that felt like they were watching me. In the middle of the night, I woke up completely unable to move or speak. As I lay there paralyzed, the television suddenly flickered on in front of me, emitting a strange, persistent beeping noise. Somehow, despite the terror, I managed to fall back asleep after a few minutes. When I woke up the next morning, I was determined to tell my mom and my Lola that they needed to burn the house down. As I started explaining the haunting, I realized how crazy I must have sounded, but I pushed through the story anyway. To my surprise, the room didn't erupt in laughter. Instead, my mom and my uncle revealed that they had experienced the exact same thing in that house. I once took my own vehicle on a field trip with one of my professors, which included a drive to the summit of Mt. Equinox in Vermont. On the way down, I began experiencing severe brake fade. I was driving a 45 horsepower VW camper, so I had very little engine braking to rely on and had to constantly cycle on and off the brakes to try and let them cool. The van had solid front discs, but they weren't the ventilated kind, and there were moments when I genuinely wasn't sure if we were going to make it down safely. I managed to keep enough control to get us to the bottom, but when I inspected the brakes a few months later, I discovered the rear drums had been worn all the way down to the metal.